Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Judy and I love travel, history, and finding out about how people live. Today we're going to walk through part of Renaissance Florence. There's a lot to see here. Dozens of museums, palaces, gardens, fountains, parks, statues, piazzas, and a great deal more, including the fabulous cathedral dome, the baptistry, and a tower. There's more to see than anyone can tackle in one day. Florence can be maddeningly overcrowded, but it is helpfully compact. I visited here several times, the first in 1970 as a nearly flat-broke college student when the city was still reeling from the destructive, massive floods of the Arno a few years previously, to most recently in 2018, when almost all the damage had been cleaned up. The city has gotten to be far more heavily visited, but in some ways it's also a great deal friendlier to tourists than it used to be because some of the streets have been pedestrianized, and if you look hard enough you can find public restrooms and water fountains. Let's share an Italian charcuterie board, which they call a tagliere, chock full of various delightful bits and snacks in the form of a highlights tour through Renaissance Florence, today on The Armchair Traveler. Santa Maria Novella is my favorite church in Florence. It sits just outside the main train station in an area which is dominated to this day by hotels. When I first arrived here, back in 1970, a half a century ago, these were extremely cheap and included student hostels, which is where I landed. Construction began on this lovely basilica around 1276, and it took about 80 years, initially in Romanesque style, which gradually over time oozed into Gothic style. You can see that reflected in the slightly pointed arches of the covered walkway in my photo on the left. There's the green and white facade you see here. There isn't much, if any, pink in it, or if there is, it's hidden under a coating of city grime. This is the real deal and dates from 1471. Keep that in mind because we're going to meet something quite similar, which is a great deal newer. The style goes by several names, including Gothic Renaissance or Florence Renaissance or Tuscan Renaissance. Whatever you call it, Renaissance architecture was born here in Florence, and as you look at the front facade or the side with its alternating striped marble forming arches of this church, you'll see similar designs throughout Tuscany. You can see the elements of the Gothic architecture, the pointed arches inside and out, giving way to something more like the classical styles of ancient Rome. Filippo Brunelleschi, and put a pin in that name because we're going to come back to him, is the father of the style. Construction like this costs real money, and it's going to be a very modest man who pays for it anonymously. The frieze above the door doesn't do anything as virtuous as dedicating this to the glory of God, but says, and pardon my Latin, Johannes Orcelarius Pauli Filius Anno Salutis, and a date. That means Giovanni Rucellai, son of Paolo, in the year of salvation 1470. You might imagine that since I've made several personal look-sees and read a bunch of books, I'd know all to know about this area. The church dominates a huge, mostly empty, and kind of boring pedestrianized piazza. Even though I've been here many times, it wasn't until my last look, doing a little bit of research for this video blog, and thanks to the help from Google Earth, which didn't exist or wasn't even dreamt of when I first got here, that I discovered for myself the secret of the piazza. This piazza is located quite close to the train station and is a good place to sit down and rest and catch your breath. I arrived in Florence last time after an overnight train trip from Palermo, in which I got about 3 hours of sleep, and a 10-hour stopover in Pisa, during which, among other things, I climbed the Leaning Tower. The Google Earth image on the left gives away the story. The piazza is oval-shaped. It turns out that unlike the obelisks in the Boboli Gardens, you can see them in my Boboli Gardens stroll, these were carved here in Italy out of Italian marble instead of being stolen from the Egyptians. Each one stands atop 4 bronze turtles. They were carved to celebrate the marriage of Grand Duke Cosimo II to Maria Magdalena of Austria. We already know that Renaissance art and architecture was a reflection of, and a return to, in some ways, the styles generated in ancient Rome. Cosimo wanted to hitch himself to the glory of the Roman Empire, so he created a chariot race. To have the chariot race, he needed a track, and this is it. The Roman Empire classical connection will resurface fairly often in Renaissance art. Although this tour is going to be mostly inside, I wanted to show you the most important chapel here in the church. It's called the Tornabuoni Chapel. The area was first frescoed at least a century before the ritzy facade went up. Unfortunately, the originals didn't stand up to time very well, so in 1485, Giovanni Tornabuoni, he must have been enormously wealthy, commissioned Domenico Ghirlandaio to redo them. Domenico had a workshop here in the city, and quite a few apprentices and collaborators flowed through his system. Among them was Michelangelo Buonarroti, the Michelangelo famous for the David, whose work we'll see again here in the city. Domenico was probably best known for his use of vivid color and emphasis on natural-looking people and things. Michelangelo's apprenticeship here, we don't know who painted which parts of the chapel, but he certainly worked on part of these frescoes, would have influenced his way of showing us painted figures in future frescoes. The detail on the right shows us the slaughter of the innocents. This composition probably drew on his knowledge. He had performed a commission for part of a fresco in the Sistine Chapel, and his time in Rome to study Roman antiquities at first hand. For example, the triumphal arch we see here. Like all artists through time, Ghirlandaio had to make his living. He couldn't just devote himself purely to art. So on some occasions, he used his talent to flatter and identify his patrons and their families. This fresco shows us the birth of the Virgin Mary. Notice the clothing and the hairstyles. These had absolutely nothing to do with the ancient Roman Empire or ancient Israel. They were the prevalent clothing style of the wealthy class in Domenico's time. And what we are looking at here is like looking at a Vogue magazine photo shoot, only dating from the 17th century. Sometimes you absolutely have to go inside or you miss the entire point of a building. The building complex here is called the Accademia, and it could be called nondescript if you wanted to be kind. The galleries are housed in what used to be the Hospital of St. Matthew and the Convent of St. Nicholas of Cafeggio. Trust me when I tell you, without knowing what's inside, no one would be drawn in from looking at the exterior architecture. However, in this case, it truly is what's inside that counts. Michelangelo, we just met him, is the real draw here, although there is a rather impressive collection of other paintings, icons, and more. On the left, you see Michelangelo's Prisoner, or sometimes it's called The Awakening Slave. If you join me for that walking tour of the Boboli Gardens, the link is in the description, you'll recall that the so-called large grotto featured a copy of this carving. The sculpture isn't finished. Apparently Michelangelo came back to it. There were supposed to be a total of 4 sculptures. Several times, but never quite completed any of them. This was commissioned for the tomb of Pope Julius II. On the right is a rather modest view of Michelangelo's David. Most people, especially the younger visitors, gawk at the full frontal nudity, but if you're willing to walk around behind, you get a clue to the man's artistry and his engineering ability. There's more to be seen. Notice the hidden structural support for the hand, only visible if you bother to walk around the back. Michelangelo apparently thought that the figures were already inside his marble and that his job as a sculptor was to chip away and release them, to reveal them to our eyes. The baptistry is the oldest of the 3 major buildings here in the Duomo Square, with construction dating back to 1059 in what's called Florentine Romanesque style, from which later architects like Brunelleschi created the Florentine Renaissance style. Notice the top. There's no dome, just a roof. Notice the workmen at the top baptistry. They were cleaning the marble, which is always a good idea. The thing to see here, and you can do it for free, are the highly decorative doors. These are copies of the originals, which are safely tucked away in a museum, but these enormous bronze doors were created by a goldsmith named Lorenzo Ghiberti between 1425 and 1452. The story goes that Michelangelo actually gave them their name. They're sometimes called the Gates of Paradise. Ghiberti was a goldsmith, but they're over 17 feet tall and weigh 3 tons, were cast in bronze and show us scenes from the Old Testament. Like his patrons, Ghiberti wanted some credit for his work. You can see his face on the 2 doorknobs shown in the detail on the right. Was he being immodest, or was he, like many of his contemporaries, merely signing his work as a way of advertising his skill? The main event on the cathedral square is the cathedral. Construction began here in 1296 on the site of a much older cathedral which was falling apart and not big enough to accommodate the growing population of the city. Other Tuscan cities had cathedrals. I already showed you the one in Pisa, which most people don't even think about. So overawing is the Leaning Tower. The Florentines had a lot of money and a good idea of what they wanted here, something big and impressive with a dome. Although at the time, no living architect really knew how to construct one. They built their cathedral with an empty space, probably covered over with timbers and some kind of roofing, until they found someone who could actually do the work. Work continued on the building in fits and starts and ran through several architects. In 1418, however, they were ready for the dome. There was a design competition to see who would win the commission. The main contestants were Lorenzo Ghiberti, the master goldsmith responsible for the doors to the baptistry, and Filippo Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi turned out to be their guy, but we'll talk more about him in just a moment. The most interesting part about the facade is that although the colors and style are in perfect symmetry with the baptistry, the bell tower, which we'll visit next, and the more distant Santa Maria Novella, the actual facade, the one that everyone ogles, is practically brand new in comparison. The model you see on the right for the original facade only bears a slight similarity to what we see today. This construction is practically brand new. The church face sat mostly undecorated until the 1880s, when there was yet another competition, with the winner bringing us the lovely facade you see on the left. The cathedral and the area around it, including the baptistry and the bell tower, are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and with good reason. The dome dominates the city skyline and can be seen clearly from miles away. I took this photograph from less than half a mile as the crow flies and a couple 100 feet above river level at the Abbey of San Miniato, although any distance as the crow flies is significant only to crows. When you've got to walk it, it seems like much further away. Brunelleschi, who won the competition for this commission, was familiar with the Pantheon dome in Rome, although that bit of architecture is flatter and had been made of concrete. The dome, I'm told, contains at least 1 million bricks. I think the red color makes it stand out in the Florentine skyline. The construction includes 2 domes, one inside the other, designed to make it a little bit lighter, and it is possible to climb up inside between the two if you want to. I'm sure there must be a gobsmacking view of the city and the countryside, but I decided against it. I had climbed the Leaning Tower of Pisa the day before, and my hip hurt. I'm not completely certain, but it might have been the presence of a ring of ambulances around the base of the cathedral waiting nearby that really put me off. Anyone who's listened to me slaughter Italian names has already guessed that I don't speak Italian, but I have spent enough time in the country to pick up a few useful phrases, things like please, thank you, and where's the bathroom. I also know that a campanile is a bell tower, in this case a freestanding and heavily decorated building. This one dates from the early 1300s. You can see in this view how it was transitional in design, with the same brightly colored marble exterior as we saw, and if anything, this is more extravagant, back at Santa Maria Novella, but still boasting some Gothic elements like those pointed windows. I always imagined that the colors and design of the bell tower and the face of the cathedral went together so well because they were about the same age, but of course I was wrong. The cathedral facade was finally finished only late in the 19th century and was apparently designed to match. I'd say they did a pretty good job. Incidentally, the bells at the top of that tower still ring, and they are very loud. The Piazza della Signoria takes its name from the Palazzo della Signoria, which is generally referred to as the Palazzo Vecchio. It includes the medieval Art Nouveau clock tower that you can see here. The Palazzo was the center of Florentine power, politics, and government, and shares space with a lot of statues, monuments, the famous loggia, and a pedestrian walkway that will lead us eventually to the Uffizi Palace. Among the many sights to be seen here is an equestrian statue of Cosimo I de' Medici. Florence had been ruled by a series of dukes from the Medici family, but Cosimo was the first Grand Duke. He came from a noble family, but not exactly a noble background. His father, whose name was Ludovico, and who went by the name of Vico, and who went by the name of Giovanni, had the nickname Giovanni of the Black Band. He was a condottiero and an excellent soldier, a mercenary in the employ of several rulers in Florence and outside of Florence. He was also an extremely unruly and violent man, and I suspect completely unsuitable to settling down and ruling a city with all the boring administrative work and political intrigue. He was not in direct line of inheritance, and I suspect no one would have ever suspected either he or his branch of the family would take command, but everyone was wrong. When the last Duke of Tuscany, Alessandro de' Medici, Tuscany, Alessandro de' Medici, died, there was no heir. The family and the influential men in the city looked around and they found Giovanni's son Cosimo. He had the blood, he had the family line. He wasn't in direct line of succession, but he was a Medici and he was quite young, only around 19. So the powers that be felt he would be easy to control and manipulate, with extra financial benefits flowing freely from him into their pockets. How wrong they were. A Florentine writer put it best: the innkeeper's reckoning is quite different from a glutton's. Cosimo was strong-willed, clever, ambitious, and soon able to take command. There was an attempted rebellion afterwards, but Cosimo sent his best troops and defeated them. He then showed the rest of them what he was made of. He had the prominent prisoners beheaded here on the piazza. 2 years later, he was confirmed by the Pope as Grand Duke, married a Spanish heiress named Eleonora, and established a line of control that lasted until the last duke died out in 1737. On the left is a copy of Michelangelo's famous David. We saw the original back in the Accademia. It was meant to be a companion to the statue you see on the right. A representation of a struggle between Hercules and Cacus, the fire-breathing son of Vulcan or Hephaestus. The family was very much interested in establishing and aligning itself with representations of the ancient Roman Empire, and this is one of them. The story goes that Cacus apparently terrorized the residents of the Aventine Hill before Rome was even established, and that Hercules eventually killed him. The changing fortunes of this statue reflect those of the de' Medici family and some of the artists of the time. The figure of Hercules was meant to represent the family or the group that was in charge of. That group kept changing. At the time of the commission, the family was out of power. The statue had been commissioned by a temporary leader of the Republic of Florence as a symbol of the Republic. Michelangelo won that commission, and although he had favored de' Medici artists, he had no trouble switching sides. Unfortunately, the block of marble for this didn't arrive in time. Michelangelo got other commissions, and the de' Medici returned to power. Work continued on the statue, however, and while that was happening, the family was kicked out again. Eventually, with the help of the Pope, the de' Medici returned to power in the form of Alessandro de' Medici, the Pope's nephew. The modeling of the bodies is quite different from the still powerful but more serene David. Cosimo was desperate to hitch his family's name and legacy to the grandeur and power of ancient Rome. The subject you see in the fountain on the left is Neptune, the Roman god of water. In 1559, Cosimo held a competition to select the artist to build the fountain. Until quite recently, and even today, fountains weren't just a place to soak your feet and fill your water bottle. In an age without public water or sewerage, the fountain represented a gift of clean water to the city. Cosimo commissioned it to celebrate the wedding of his son and heir. The story goes that the enormous Neptune's face was modeled after Cosimo's. It's a little difficult to tell. In the portrait, Cosimo was portrayed as mostly clean-shaven, but there does seem to be a resemblance in the nose and hooded eyes, at least to me. Judith and Holofernes is a bronze statue by Italian Renaissance sculptor Donatello. The original is tucked away in the Lily Hall and shown on the left, inside the Palazzo Vecchio. But since we're not going inside, we can still see a rather good bronze copy of it out here on the piazza. If you're not familiar with the story, that might be because the Book of Judith is excluded from the Protestant Bible. The story goes that Judith was a beautiful Jewish widow who was spotted by an Assyrian general named Holofernes, whose army was besieging the city. Judith used her beauty to charm and kill him, reportedly lopping off his head with his own sword. In so doing, she saved her city and nearby Jerusalem from probable total destruction. You can find out a bit more about her and some of the artistic portrayals of her by a female Florentine artist named Artemisia Gentileschi in my Makers of History series. The Renaissance gave us so many wonderful artists that I've barely been able to scratch the surface in this walk. Benvenuto Cellini was a silversmith, a sculptor, and an author. His Perseus with the head of Medusa, shown here, might be his best-known sculpture. The image on the left shows that the statue stands on a very tall pedestal. On the right, you can see Perseus holding up the Medusa's head. You can also see his feet on the bottom right, standing on top of the wretched woman's body. The artwork was commissioned by Cosimo I, whose memorial statue we saw earlier in our walk. The family was fabulously wealthy, sponsored the greatest artists of their days, and put the originals in some pieces outside for everyone to look at. When this was first displayed, and as far as I can tell, this is the original, not a copy, it stood with the originals of Michelangelo's David, Bandinelli's Hercules and Cacus, and Donatello's Judith and Holofernes. We've seen all of the big four today, although the others are copies. This one is the original. If you've traveled with me before, you already know that I'm a very specialized shopper. I'm always on the lookout for city markets and always have been. This is the Loggia, or New Market, although it actually dates from the 16th century. It's quite close to the Palazzo Vecchio and was originally designed to be a silk market. Since at least my time, this has been the location of the famous Florence leather market. Even in 1970, though, you had to pay attention, know what you were looking for, and be willing to haggle. I bought a wonderful small leather wallet and a passport holder. In the past half-century, the wallet has vanished, perhaps in a move, but I still haven't used the passport holder. Just beyond is the Uffizi Gallery, but we'll have to tackle that in another visit. This is The Little Boar, a reproduction of a reproduction, originally intended for the Boboli Gardens, which itself was a copy of a Greek original. The lady facing the statue, it's never operated as a fountain in my day, is trying to feed the pig. The idea here is to put a coin in the pig's maw. If it falls through the grating in front of its feet and you rub the snout, the tradition is you'll one day return to Florence. I think everyone who comes here performs the ritual in hopes of returning one day to this lovely city. I know I did. Thank you for visiting Florence's exterior highlights with me today. Come back next time for another adventure here on The Armchair Traveler.